The philosophical quest for a critical or even heroic position outside the European middle class, which we discussed in the last lecture, is a phenomenon that reached its culmination in the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived from 1844 to 1900. And Nietzsche's death in 1900 can be taken, I think, as a symbolic ending point for 19th century European intellectual history. But Nietzsche's significance as a transitional figure goes well beyond the date of his death. In fact, Nietzsche stopped writing in 1889, but for the purposes of this course, it's convenient that he died in 1900 because this is the moment of transition toward the 20th century. And in fact, Nietzsche's work marks a transition from the 19th century into a whole series of intellectual concerns that dominated many of the 20th century cultural debates. For example, Nietzsche was highly concerned with the importance of language, or the question of language, with the nature of power, with the relativism of truth, with the meaning of ethics, and also with a critique of democracy. And all of these are issues that became major themes in 20th century intellectual life, but Nietzsche had already begun discussing them in the late 19th century. So in these respects, Nietzsche represents an especially influential example of the late 19th century critique of the Enlightenment, which would be continued into the 20th century. I began these lectures by suggesting that modern European intellectual history can be described as a recurring debate about the cultural meaning and legacy of the Enlightenment. It might even be described as an ongoing dialogue with the thinkers of the 18th century. The 19th century thinkers were always in a conversation with the previous century. And Nietzsche was an eager participant in this debate. He was very interested in the legacy of the 18th century and in the legacy of the French Revolution. Even though he himself was German, he saw the French Revolution as one of those turning points in European history. Now, on the one hand, Nietzsche accepted a number of Enlightenment assumptions about various aspects of culture and society. For example, Nietzsche very much believed, like many philosophers, that there were profound flaws in traditional religious beliefs. So he shared much of the Enlightenment skepticism about religion. But he also shared in the 18th century confidence in the great potential and power of human creativity. He shared that belief that human beings could create, that human beings had an almost unlimited potential. So in those respects, we could see Nietzsche as an heir of the Enlightenment tradition. But on the other hand, Nietzsche rejected the philosoph's faith in reason. He was very skeptical about reason as a source of truth. And he also denied the very existence of universal truths. He put much more emphasis on the cultural specificity of truths. And in that respect, he broke with the Enlightenment. And he also described the will to power rather than the use of reason as the key human trait. And so in all of these respects, he was very critical of the legacy of 18th century thought. And Nietzsche's critique of reason and his epistemological assumptions about truth as something created by language and culture, Nietzsche's ideas in this respect would be very much embraced by many 20th century philosophers who were looking for alternatives to Enlightenment conceptions of reason and truth. We could say that Nietzsche became the great leader of a new movement critiquing the Enlightenment. At the same time, his fascination with the will to power, what he called the will to power, his fascination with this will to power and his critique of democracy would become important to various political movements in the 20th century. In fact, his praise for what he called the noble few, the elite, would be embraced and distorted by many 20th century political movements, including, above all, fascism, or in his own native German society, Nazism. And historians have often debated what is the relation between Nietzsche and the Nazis. I think most scholars believe the Nazis profoundly distorted Nietzsche, but there are clearly elements of his thought, some of his Darwinian themes or his emphasis on the will to power that can be twisted more or less readily into certain themes of the Nazi movement. So this is a continuing debate about Nietzsche. What is his relation to the 20th century political movements that developed later? But in this concluding lecture, I don't really want to talk about Nietzsche and the Nazis or these political debates. I want to summarize some key themes of Nietzsche's life and thought, and then I want to suggest how his critique of 19th century European culture brings us back to questions about the Enlightenment, the point at which we began this course. And I think Nietzsche is an excellent way in which to do this. He offers us a way into this dialogue because Nietzsche himself was in this dialogue with 18th century philosophers and more generally with the entire Western philosophical tradition. So Nietzsche is a part of this dialogue that I've been describing. At the same time that he's engaged in a dialogue with the 18th century, Nietzsche marks the starting point for the intellectual history of the 20th century. And that's why, in many ways, he's an appropriate figure for the ending point of this course. So what did Nietzsche promote? What kinds of ideas? That's the question I want to take up now. Nietzsche shared much of Kierkegaard's view of modern human societies and religion, but he pushed his analysis of modernity in a very different direction. Although Nietzsche agreed with critics who condemned the emptiness and mediocrity of modern European culture, he decided that the individual must make some kind of heroic leap toward the self rather than toward God or toward high culture. He didn't follow Kierkegaard in the belief in God, and he didn't follow people like Arnold in thinking that high culture was the solution for the emptiness or the mediocrity of modern mass society. In fact, Nietzsche said that God was dead. And he also said that an excessive respect for high cultural traditions destroyed creativity and life itself. That people who were obsessed with tradition or with the great works of the past lost the creative will within themselves. And so he was skeptical about religion and also about high culture. And writing in a post-Darwinian period, Nietzsche stressed that human beings were biological creatures, not part of any kind of divine order, but they were rooted in their bodies. And that the human will, which comes out of the drives, out of the deep instincts of human beings, the human will is the only real force in personal and cultural life. There's no higher reality. There's no transcendent being that gives force or meaning to life. It is the human will that creates human life and human activities. So as Nietzsche described it, only human drives and only human will could overcome the hollowness or the emptiness of modern life. There was nowhere else to turn but to human beings themselves, because neither religion, nor traditional philosophy, nor modern democracy, nor German nationalism, or any of the other isms of the day could destroy the empty, mediocre conditions of 19th century culture. So Nietzsche was an elitist. He believed that only a few strong, lonely, new thinkers could move beyond the mediocrity of the times, the mediocrity of mass culture and mass politics. And he argued that these elite thinkers, these creative few thinkers, would have to think with a hammer. That was the metaphor he liked to use, thinking with a hammer, in order to smash the reigning pieties of the day. So if one were going to think of an artwork with Nietzsche, you should think of Nietzsche holding a hammer as he faces the metaphysical and religious traditions of Western culture. Now, Nietzsche's rejection of traditional religion and morality and German nationalism was at radical odds with his own background. This is one of the great paradoxes of Nietzsche's life and thought, because he was born into an extremely pious and patriotic family. You would have thought that if his lessons had taken hold, he would have been a good, loyal German religious patriot. His father was a Lutheran minister, as in fact his mother's father was also a Lutheran minister. So he was both the son and grandson of Lutheran ministers. And young Friedrich was in fact named for Friedrich Wilhelm IV, the King of Prussia, because his father, Friedrich Nietzsche's father, was a great admirer of the King of Prussia. And so he came into this world, young Friedrich Nietzsche, as part of a patriotic religious household. But Nietzsche's father had a complete mental breakdown when young Nietzsche was only 4 years old. And then the father died. So young Nietzsche did not have a father as he was growing up. He was actually raised by his mother, by his grandmother, by 2 aunts, and also he had a younger sister. So he grew up in a household of women. And some scholars have gone so far as to argue that this upbringing contributed to the hostility for women that appears in many of his later writings. That's a kind of a psychological explanation for why he was often misogynist in his writings. We don't know exactly what produced some of his attitudes about women, but we do know he grew up in a kind of hothouse environment without any men in the household. And Nietzsche never married. He never really lived in close relationships with women later in life, although he had some women friends and he had some close male friends. He was not a recluse until perhaps the very last years of his life before he went insane. Nietzsche studied philology and the history of ancient languages. And as a young man, he was named professor at the University of Basel in Switzerland at age 24. He was named a professor of philology and the study of languages at an incredibly early age. It was almost unprecedented that a man of that age would be given such an appointment. And he was considered a brilliant young philologist, one of the great linguistic scholars of his generation. But after he took up his position, he had constant health problems. And eventually he resigned his academic position when he was only 34 years old. So he got a very early start on his academic career, and then he had a very early retirement from his academic careers. And some historians think he was infected with syphilis. This was the origin of his health problems. And when he was a young man, he was in the army for a short time, and the argument is that he visited a brothel, that he had a brief relationship with a prostitute and ended up with syphilis. But no one can prove this for sure. All that we know is that he had persistent health problems throughout his life. He had stomach problems, he had headaches, and there seems to be a recurring problem here that suggests a fundamental health issue that may have come from his young manhood. But after he resigned from the University of Basel at age 34, Nietzsche wandered for years around southern Europe. He never lived in one place after that. He lived alone, he wrote books, and he traveled. And he wrote books about the crisis in European civilization. He said that the European tradition was basically exhausted, that it had lost its intellectual and cultural vitality. And he tried to develop both a critique of that tradition and a new philosophy of heroic individual morality. And he continued to work on this until he went insane in 1889. And again, we don't know exactly why he went insane, perhaps because of syphilis, as some scholars have argued, perhaps because of the physical and mental problems that struck his father. There may have been some inherited problem there. We don't know exactly what caused it, but we do know that on the last day before they took him away, he saw a man beating a horse in the street, flogging a horse in Italy, in a city in Italy, in Turin, I believe. And Nietzsche ran up and tried to embrace the horse. And he was knocked to the ground, and they came and they dragged him away. And he then was taken to a hospital. And he spent his last 11 years, more or less, in asylums. Occasionally he went to be with his mother, but most of the time he was in an asylum. And he never wrote another page. So his intellectual career ended abruptly when he was still in his 40s. But apart from the question of syphilis or an inherited physical problem, some scholars have argued that the sheer intensity of Nietzsche's philosophical struggle could have pushed him over the psychological edge.